It's May in Robin Hood Hills. The cicadas aren't out yet, but you can hear frogs and the far hum of the interstate. 3 little boys ride bikes near Goodwin Road, and something about the stillness of that day, it doesn't fit what comes next.
Wow.
On May 6, 1993, a black child's shoe floats in a muddy drainage ditch. An officer steps into the water and finds a body, then 2 more. Stevie Branch, Chris Byers, Michael Moore, 8 years old, hog-tied with their own shoelaces, naked, face down in a shallow channel. It's one of those scenes that gets imprinted in a town's memory.
That image, hog-tied with their own laces. Yeah, it's haunting.
I remember growing up in the South during the tail end of the Satanic Panic. You hear a case like this and your skin tightens because the community already had a template for evil. Black clothes, heavy metal, occult books. In West Memphis, that template found a candidate, Damien Echols, alienated, poor, reading Stephen King and Nietzsche, an easy symbol for what frightened people.
Right. And those cultural cues, what people wore or read, got treated as evidence.
So let's walk through how the case crystallized. In the weeks after the discovery, police interviews spun a web of rumors about cult stuff. Then, on June 3, 1993, there's a marathon interrogation of 17-year-old Jessie Misskelley Jr. He signs a statement implicating himself, Damien Echols, and Jason Baldwin. Jesse's IQ was reported around 72. He was interrogated for roughly 12 hours, much of it unrecorded. The confession became the backbone of the prosecution's case, even though it was full of inconsistencies.
Maya, that part is so important. You see this in interrogation literature. A young man, low IQ, long interrogation, and suggestive questioning. The detectives corrected him on details, fed him timeline elements. He moved from saying the attack was in the morning to, after being prompted, saying it was after school. Those corrections matter.
They matter a lot. Jurors later said he wouldn't confess to something like that if he didn't know about it. And because we, humans, treat confessions as sacred, the problems in the interrogation were largely drowned out by the fact that a confession existed.
Yeah, but legally, a confession is not the same as proof, especially when it's produced under those conditions.
Exactly. Let's walk the crime scene in more detail, because the scene itself both suggested ritual and hid other explanations. The boys were found close together in a drainage channel near a pipe bridge. The water was shallow and muddy. Clothing was found jammed under mud and sticks nearby, some items turned inside out, some with rips. The bindings, hog ties using the boys' own shoelaces, were tied in 2 different knot styles, which suggests the possibility of more than one person tying them.
There's another point here. The bindings weren't tight enough to leave the deep ligature marks you'd expect from someone held for a prolonged period. That alters the hypothesis about how long they were restrained and whether the tying was done during a frantic assault or after death.
And that feeds directly into autopsy interpretations. The original medical examiner, Dr. Frank Peretti, testified to blunt force trauma and also described what he took to be sexual mutilation on Chris Byers. That image of ritual mutilation fed the satanic narrative.
But later, independent experts, people like Dr. Werner Spitz and Dr. Michael Baden, revisited photos and reports and concluded differently. They flagged many so-called knife wounds as consistent with post-mortem animal predation, turtles, aquatic scavengers. Chris's genital injuries likely occurred after death. The lack of blood on the ground and at the ditch favored post-mortem injury rather than live mutilation.
Yes, that's one of those moments where the clinical detail pulls the story away from myth. The boys likely died of blunt force trauma. Drowning was not the primary cause. Water in the lungs didn't indicate drowning. But the sensational idea, ritual mutilation, stuck in public imagination, and at trial, an expert who styled himself a cult crime authority bolstered that narrative.
And then we have this forensic gap.
No fingerprints of Echols, Baldwin, or Misskelley at the scene, no blood or tissue tying them to the ditch, no weapon conclusively connected to them. Fiber comparisons were used, but fiber matches are non-specific. Millions of people might have similar fibers in their homes.
Right fiber testimony was overstated at trial. What we didn't have was nuclear DNA linking the teens to the scene. Years later, mitochondrial DNA testing on hairs recovered from the ligatures and tree roots excluded the 3 teens and identified profiles not inconsistent with other local men, most notably Terry Hobbs, Stevie Branch's stepfather, and David Jacoby, a friend of Hobbs.
The phrase "not inconsistent with" is important to explain. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited maternally. It can exclude people, but it cannot uniquely identify an individual the way nuclear DNA can. So when a hair on a shoelace is not inconsistent with Terry Hobbs, it doesn't convict him, but crucially, it excludes Echols, Baldwin, and Misskelley from that piece of evidence.
Exactly. Now, hold on. Let me ask you, Caleb. Why would police not aggressively pursue someone like Terry Hobbs early on, given he was a close family member of a victim?
Maya, that's the heart of a lot of investigative failure. In child homicide cases, you start with family and close associates. But in West Memphis, the investigators were fixated on the idea of an other, an outside evil. The cultural panic made Damien the perfect suspect, and that narrowed the lens. Hobbs, despite being the boy's stepfather and later showing contradictions in his timeline, was not thoroughly vetted initially. That's a procedural blind spot born of narrative bias.
Hobbs's timeline did shift. He said he'd driven his wife Pam to work, searched, was with David Jacoby. Years later, Jacoby's affidavit suggested periods where Hobbs left him alone, contradicting Hobbs's earlier statements. Pam herself would later express doubts about the teen's guilt and sign statements pointing suspiciously toward Terry. She also said she found a pocket knife among Terry's things that belonged to Stevie. That's haunting.
It's complicated. Hobbs offered secondary transfer explanations for the hair, saying the boys played at his house, so his hair could have gotten on them earlier. But critics point out it's far less likely for someone's hair to end up tied in the knot of a ligature by secondary transfer than simply on clothing.
Which raises the question, if a hair in a ligature had matched Damien Echols, would the police have accepted secondary transfer as an explanation? Or would that have been seen as damning? It's hard not to see a double standard.
It's a fair question. We see confirmation bias in many cases. Once investigators have a theory, they interpret evidence in light of it.
Let's talk about the trials. Misskelley was tried separately because of his confession. He was convicted. Echols and Baldwin were tried together and convicted in 1994. Echols got the death penalty. Baldwin received life without parole. Jailhouse informant testimony and the cult expert fed the prosecution's narrative. The community wanted a villain quickly.
And the jurors were human. They heard a confession, a narrative about ritual, the cultural image of a monster. They didn't have the benefit of later DNA testing, nor the later expert reanalysis of wounds. They had what the state presented, and they convicted.
Years passed. The spotlight shifted internationally. HBO's Paradise Lost documentaries and later West of Memphis turned this into a global cause. New tests in the 2000s, the mitochondrial hair tests, excluded the 3 teens from hairs and pointed toward Hobbs and Jacoby. For the men in prison, that created a legal opening.
And the legal machinery began to move. Appeals citing new forensic analysis, ineffective counsel, and exclusionary DNA results pushed for evidentiary hearings. But the process was slow and politically fraught.
And then the legal resolution in 2011, the Alford plea. I want to explain that plainly. Under an Alford plea, defendants maintain their innocence, but acknowledge the state has enough evidence to likely convict at trial. On August 19, 2011, the 3 men entered Alford pleas to reduced charges. Their original convictions were vacated, and they were released that same day, after 18 years behind bars. but they weren't exonerated. In the eyes of the law, they were still guilty.
The plea is a kind of legal truce. For state officials, it avoids a retrial that might expose investigative failures. For defendants, it's a guaranteed path to freedom without the uncertainty of another trial, or for Damien, the very real threat of execution.
It leaves a very bitter aftertaste. Freedom, yes, but with a felony on the record and the stigma of being legally labeled the killers of 3 children. It also preserved the state's narrative and shielded it from many civil liabilities and from having to say, we made a catastrophic mistake.
And it leaves the victims' families in a limbo. Some families supported the men's release, others felt robbed of a full accounting. The core fact remained. Stevie, Chris, and Michael were dead, and no one had been formally identified as the killer or killers in a way that satisfied the evidence.
That brings us to the persistent forensic questions. The original prosecution relied heavily on Misskelley's confession, jailhouse informants.
The hair evidence is striking. Hairs recovered from ligatures and tree roots were tested using mitochondrial analysis in the 2000s. They excluded the 3 convicted teens and matched profiles compatible with Terry Hobbs and David Jacoby. Again, that's not a smoking gun, but it's a piece of objective evidence that didn't square with the prosecution's case.
And so the question remains, why not reopen the investigation and put real attention on the people the DNA points toward? Part of that is institutional self-protection. Admitting error in a high-profile case implies catastrophic failure by police, prosecutors, and judges. It's politically and legally costly.
There's also the finality bias. Courts and prosecutors emphasize finality. And with the offered pleas, the state could say, case closed. But closure isn't the same as justice. There's a moral gap between a file being closed and a crime being solved.
In 2025, there was another development. An Arkansas judge ordered renewed DNA testing of physical evidence, including ligatures and hairs, to be run with more advanced methods. That shows the legal system is still, slowly, revisiting what should have been asked long ago. It's a reminder that science evolves, and that evidence once unusable can become decisive with better tools.
It also highlights a practical point. When investigators contaminate a scene, or when members of the community wade through a ditch and move things, that complicates later testing. The initial crime scene management in Robin Hood Hills was chaotic. Dozens of officers and volunteers entered the area. There wasn't a tight grid search. That makes modern testing harder to interpret, though still potentially informative.
Let's name a few of the enduring, uncomfortable questions. 1. Who actually killed Stevie, Chris, and Michael? 2. Why were close family members and associates not thoroughly vetted early on? 3. How many other cases around that period were built on moral panics, coerced confessions, and junk science? And 4. What does justice look like when your freedom comes through an Alford plea?
Those are systemic questions. They reach beyond West Memphis. False confessions are not rare, particularly among vulnerable populations, juveniles, people with intellectual disabilities, those subjected to prolonged, suggestive interrogation. The system needs safeguards, mandatory recordings of all interrogations, access to counsel, and skepticism toward non-specific forensic claims.
It's tempting to reduce this to a simple narrative, 3 goth kids framed by a town. That is partial truth, but we also need to center the victims. Stevie, Chris, Michael. Their bodies were found together. Their clothes were hidden in the mud. Their lives ended in a place children played. Whatever narrative we accept, whether it's monsters outside or violent men nearby, the grief is the same.
And there's the moral outrage. A community wanted answers and found an explanation that fit its fears. We should be uneasy whenever evidence is bent to fit a story people want to believe.
Caleb,
how do you explain the juror's willingness to believe the confession despite its flaws? I mean, what's happening cognitively?
People see a confession and fall into what's called the fundamental attribution error, assuming actions reveal character. Jurors trust the idea that someone who confesses must be culpable. Add to that emotional context, the murder of children, and cognitive load pushes people toward quick moral judgments rather than careful parsing of forensic contradictions. Combine that with expert testimony framed dramatically, this was ritual, and you have a powerful cocktail.
And once a story takes hold, confirmation bias does the rest. I want to pause for a moment. This is the part where my voice shakes sometimes because, as a reporter who grew up in that culture, you have to balance outrage with compassion. The three men spent 18 years in prison. They came out not exonerated, but free. The families of the victims still have no complete legal accounting. That's a moral wound that hasn't healed.
There's also the practical aftermath for the men. They carry felony convictions. Their lives are altered in ways that a clean exoneration could have remedied. Employment, travel, stigma, these are concrete harms.
So, where do we go from here? There's renewed DNA testing, and that could clarify things further. But equally important is institutional reform, better interrogation safeguards, improved crime scene protocols, and less deference to moral panic-style expert testimony.
And for listeners who focus on evidence, demand transparency. When a case hinges on a confession from a vulnerable teen, on exotic expert testimony about occult ritual, or on fiber comparisons that are nonspecific, ask for corroboration. Forensic science has matured. It's unfair when outdated practices are allowed to decide lives.
We can also be honest about what an Alford plea represents. It's a pragmatic tool. Sometimes it saves lives, literally, in death penalty contexts. But it's also a way for institutions to avoid accountability. For the West Memphis 3, the plea secured freedom, but not formal exoneration, and it left many answers unasked.
Maya, do you think the renewed testing in 2025 could actually lead to new charges against someone like Terry Hobbs?
I don't want to speculate beyond the evidence we have. The source material tells us the 2025 order is for advanced testing of ligatures and hair. If those tests produce nuclear DNA profiles that point to a living, identifiable suspect, prosecutors could act. But there are legal and political barriers. The Alford pleas complicate things. The evidence chain is imperfect because of early contamination, and prosecutors may resist reopening a high-profile file. That said, improved DNA could change the conversation in a way the mitochondrial matches only hinted at.
It's one of those moments where science can compel action, but only if the system is willing to follow the data.
Before we wrap, I want to bring it back to the boys. Stevie, Chris, Michael. Say their names with me. Stevie Branch, Christopher Byers, Michael Moore. Their names are the reason we keep pushing on the evidence.
Say their names.
Stevie, Chris, Michael.
And remember the ditch.
We'll keep watching the testing. We'll keep asking why the initial investigation went the way it did. And we'll keep holding to a basic standard. Fear cannot be allowed to substitute for evidence. I'm Maya Ellison.
And I'm Dr. Caleb Hart. Thanks for listening to this episode of Still Unanswered. If you want to read more, if you want the deep dives and the court documents, we'll post the sources we used, including the mitochondrial testing reports and the timelines that matter.
By the way, one last note. If you grew up in that era, you remember how stories about ritual danger filled late-night talk shows and seminar halls. This case is a reminder that moral panics have victims beyond the obvious ones. They can lead to real people being scapegoated, while the real causes of violence go unexamined. We'll be back next week.
Uh-huh.